Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible until it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's your host, Joe Cirincione.
Thank you, Del, and welcome back. This is our 25th episode of Press the Button. Our co-host, Michelle Dover, is on the road, so you're stuck with me this week. This is a special impeachment episode of Press the Button. We start off covering the news in our early warning segment, taking a first look at how impeachment might affect nuclear policy and national security. We're joined by Mary Kaszynski, our policy director here, and Abigail Stowe-Thurston from the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. We then go to our Q&A, a question sent in from Susan in California. She asked us about climate change and nuclear weapons. I love this segment. They surprise me every week with a question I haven't heard yet. If you would like to ask me a question, just send it in an email to pressthebutton, one word, pressthebutton at ploughshares.org. And we have a special interview for you this week. You're not going to want to miss it. This is with Representative Khanna from California's 17th District. We caught up with him minutes before he joined the Democratic caucus meeting on the House side to decide on whether to proceed with an impeachment inquiry. You're going to want to hear what he has to say about that and about his legislation that's on the Defense Authorization Bill to prohibit funding for an unauthorized war with Iran. Representative Khanna serves on the House Armed Services Committee, so he's part of this conference, but he's also on the Budget Committee and the Oversight Committee, and he is the first vice chair of the Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives. Finally, we have a special In the Silo segment this week. We sent Elissa Karim, our development associate in the Ploughshares San Francisco office, to cover the August 6th protests at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. She took us in front of the gates and behind the scenes for this Hiroshima Day protest. And if you like what you hear, please rate us, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with your friends and family. We have a lot to talk about, and the clock is ticking. Let's go.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
And welcome to Early Warning. I'm here with our Deputy Director for Policy, Mary Kaszynski, and with Abigail Stowe-Thurston, who's the Program Coordinator for No First Use at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks you, Joe. For having us.
We got a lot to talk about on this special impeachment edition of Early Warning. I want to talk about how the impeachment crisis could impact nuclear and national security policy. I did a quick tweet thread about this last week, and I saw there were 3 threats. One is the risk that in order to distract from attention and to rally his base, the president might be tempted to instigate a foreign military conflict to create a diversion, the so-called wag the dog scenario. The second I worried about was that a desperate, perhaps irrational president might actually launch a nuclear weapon, something he's alluded to over the last 2.5 years, something he's threatened to do. But ironically, while there are restraints on a president's ability to launch a war, and a large number of people he would have to consult with in order to do that, the most destructive act has the fewest restraints. He could literally, as Richard Nixon said, pick up the phone in his office, and in 30 minutes, millions of people would be dead. So that's the second risk. And the third is the possibility that other nations might take advantage of this crisis to do a variety of things. For example, launch aggression against their own neighbors. We already see India's Modi doing this with Kashmir with little U.S. reaction. Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel has threatened to annex parts of the West Bank. Again, very little U.S. reaction. So there might be more aggression in the world, or there could be leaders coming to the United States and offering dirt on President Trump's political opponents in exchange for secret agreements that would benefit them personally or benefit their country. So let me turn to you, Abigail, to ask you about the second of those threats. How real is the risk that the president might actually launch a nuclear weapon during this impeachment crisis?
Yeah, so I don't want to put the idea in anyone's heads that it's a very likely probability that the president would launch nuclear weapons during an impeachment process. But the fact that he has the ability to do so is troubling. I think what we see, if you read the actual whistleblower complaint, it's a problem with process or not following foreign policy and national security processes. With the Nuclear Launch Authority, it's a problem with the process itself. It's always been flawed, and now we have a president who unfortunately is demonstrating just how flawed. There is some risk because he has the ability to launch nuclear weapons with very few checks and balances, almost none, in fact, that he could and might do that.
Right, so as long as he chose a pre-vetted launch option, he could fire 1, 2, 3, and it would be a legal order, and the military would be required to implement that legal order.
Right, and to fail or to refuse to implement that legal order could cause a massive constitutional crisis.
Right. And how about the first risk, Mary? The most likely prospect, I think, is the one you spend most of your time working on, the risk of war with Iran.
Sure. So this is a very real risk. We've all seen that Trump apparently doesn't want a war with Iran. But as the impeachment process moves forward and he becomes increasingly desperate, he might be looking for a national security win or a distraction from his current problems. So the first risk is the threat that Trump might see war with Iran as beneficial to him, and he might launch military strikes against Iran, again, as a foreign policy, as a distraction from his national security problems. On the other hand, there's also a chance that he might be looking for a diplomatic deal with Iran. There is actually a very real chance of this too. Now, it doesn't seem very likely.
Well, what happened last week? There was talk of, before the impeachment scandal broke, of President Rouhani of Iran possibly meeting with President Trump. What happened?
Well, there was no meeting, although there had been a lot of talk about it. I think the Saudi oil attacks made that very difficult. On the other hand, what also makes it difficult is that the Iranians are very clearly looking for sanctions relief before such a meeting because they don't want it to be just a photo op. And Trump has made it very clear that he is not willing to give sanctions relief.
Do you think he understood that?
He might not have understood how very serious the Iranians were, that they wanted guarantees about sanctions relief before a meeting.
So nothing happened. What do you think? Might the impeachment process actually propel diplomacy, not war?
It's certainly very possible. Now, a diplomatic deal would be very difficult.
I don't know if the Trump administration is up to it. I don't know if they've got the personnel to actually put together a serious negotiation with Iran at this point.
Well, I think what makes it a possibility is that the Trump administration, and particularly Trump himself, is not aware of what's in the current deal. So if you could put together a package that is very similar to the current deal and call it a better deal, Trump might go for it.
And let me ask both of you, on the risk of war with Iran, there's legislation that was attached to the Defense Authorization Bill in the House that by Representative Khanna, who we're about to interview later on in this segment, that would prohibit the expenditure of U.S. funds for an unauthorized war with Iran. Abigail, what do you think of that legislation? What do you think its chances are?
Yeah, I think, at least I hope that there's a good chance that it will go through the conference. Right now it's in the House bill, but not the Senate bill. So negotiators on the Senate side would have to agree to keep that provision in the final package. But I'm hopeful that will happen. I think it's a positive amendment.
Mary, what's your take?
I think the real challenge is that Republicans are very opposed to the legislation. They're going to fight it very, very hard. And that's not because the legislation does anything different from what's in current law. It simply restates what's in the Constitution and what is in the War Powers Resolution. However, Republicans are opposed to it frankly, for partisan reasons. So,
are the Democrats willing to fight for this?
That's the real question. Democrats have leverage. They have control of one chamber, and if they fight for it, it has a chance of making it through. If it doesn't make it through, it will be because Democrats caved.
Are they more concerned about the contracts and funding than they are about the policy?
Exactly. If they put those priorities, those defense contractor priorities, ahead of preventing war with Iran.
Never underestimate the power of money or the sirens, which are coming and telling us, unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Abigail.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe.
We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
Another week, another question. Joe, are you ready for this?
I am. Let's go, Michelle.
So, our question this week is from Susan in California. Susan asks, it feels like everyone is focused on the climate and less concerned about nuclear weapons like they were during the Cold War. But wouldn't the use of nuclear weapons have huge climate consequences too? How are these two issues linked? Why don't more people realize the connection between them?
Wow, very good. Great question, Susan. And stay tuned for our In the Silo segment at the end of this episode, where you'll hear people demonstrating outside Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories, feeling exactly what you're feeling, Susan, that people are not paying enough attention, that this is an existential threat and we have to take action now. But to connect, there are lots of problems that we face in our lives and challenges with our family, with our homes, with our state and local governments, but there are only two challenges that threaten destruction on a planetary scale, and that's climate change and nuclear weapons. Climate change can destroy humanity in decades, and nuclear weapons can do it in an afternoon. One has now received sustained, detailed exposure and explanation, in part because of the role of philanthropies like ours. Frankly, nuclear weapons come and go depending on the crisis of the moment. I would say we're in a moment now where nuclear weapons issues are more prominent than they have been in the past. In some ways, the mental instability of the President of the United States has exposed the underlying insanity of the nuclear system, where we give one person the ability to destroy humanity with the press of a button in an instant, and no one can stop them. Sole authority, launch on warning, policy that says we can use nuclear weapons first. These archaic Cold War policies developed in another era create a situation where one person can destroy in minutes everything that humanity has built over millennia. Is there an actual connection? Besides that, is there a physical connection between climate change and nuclear weapons? Yes, there is. Not the way you might think, though. Scientists in the 1980s realized that the use of hundreds of nuclear weapons, according to their calculations, would put enough smoke and particulates into the atmosphere that, caused by the mega fires these weapons would ignite, that they would cover the Earth in clouds, blocking the sun's rays, dropping global temperatures 2 or 3 degrees for a sustained period of time. Doesn't sound like much, and maybe you think that's a solution to global warming, except it produces a winter, a chill that could kill 40% of the food crops in the world, 50% of the food crops, 60%, all of the food crops, depending on how many weapons are used, and that would cause global famine. And what we're seeing now is that scientists, with the climate tools they have updated these analyses, and they realize that as few as 100 weapons used in South Asia, for example, India and Pakistan, who have about 300 weapons between them, just 100 weapons could cause that kind of catastrophe, could cause a famine that would kill 1 billion people on Earth. You talk about numbers like that, the migrations, the instability, and you're talking about the shattering human civilization, shattering nation states, shattering governance, and the ability for us to rationally rule. So yeah, there's a connection both in the scale of the devastation both of these crises caused, and in the fact that we now have in our power the ability to change the climate of the entire planet in hours, and not in a good way.
Well, and before we close on this, there's another element as well, and that's the production and the level of energy and greenhouse gases caused by the production of these weapons, the mining and the disposal, as well as actually separating out and enriching the uranium. But our time is up. So we learn something new every week. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Susan. I'm Joe Cirincione. I'm here in the Cannon office building with Representative Khanna. Representative Khanna, thank you so much for sitting down with us.
Well, Joe, thank you, and thank you for your voice on issues of military restraint and national security.
You're very kind, sir. And we're catching you at a busy day. We're recording this on September 24th, and news has just broken that the House will indeed go ahead with impeachment proceedings, and you have to run off very quickly to an important Democratic caucus meeting. Can you tell us, sir, why you think it's important for the House to go ahead with impeachment?
Well, the recent allegations of the president pressuring a foreign government to investigate his political rival is exactly what our founders feared when they wrote the Constitution about election interference. Hamilton in Federalist 68 talks about foreign interference being the biggest security threat to our republic. And as you know, our founders were very concerned with a fledgling republic, whether Britain or France would be competing in the United States for their own interests. And that's why the primary clause in impeachment was impeachment for bribery or treason. It was a concern that someone may use foreign interference. So what you have here is an explosive allegation that the president has actually solicited foreign interference in an election. And if we care about our constitutional duty, if we care about what the founders were trying to safeguard America from, then we have to proceed with impeachment proceedings.
And are there other issues as well that have led you to announce, I think it was right before Labor Day, that
Yes.
you had shifted to being in favor of impeachment?
The systematic assault on the independence of the judiciary and the president's disregard for the separation of powers is what really concerned me. And it was not just the act of sabotaging the Mueller investigation. It was a total defiance of Congress, not cooperating with any subpoenas, not handing over any documents, not having any transparency, not having any remorse of having broken the law. And so for me, that was cumulatively too much to just give a free pass on.
And what do you think the national security implications of the impeachment proceedings itself could be? We came here to talk to you about your legislation prohibiting an unauthorized war with Iran.
Right.
What do you think? How do you think this impacts?
Well, the first thing it does is it impacts our leadership in the world. Our biggest claim to leadership is our moral leadership, our leadership of example as the nation with the greatest democratic principles and with an aspiration of people around the world to come to America. And this morning I was seeing on CNN, and you had the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson being asked about whether he was going to resign, and the American president being asked about whether he would be impeached. And you wonder, where is leadership for democratic values? And are we ceding the moral high ground to other countries? That's my first concern. And of course, second is always the concern that instability within your body politics and division is something that other countries could take advantage of or could lead to desperate action by the White House.
Well, that in particular, so President Trump appears to be opposed to war with Iran. He went against the recommendations of his then national defense officials. Do you think an impeachment proceeding could change that calculus? Might he be looking for a distraction, like a military conflict with Iran?
I personally don't think it will be Iran because this president seems to understand what a catastrophic blunder it would be to get into war in Iran, and it would actually, in my view, kill any of his chances for re-election. This country is wary of another engagement in the Middle East. The president, frankly, understands that more than any of his advisors because he's had to campaign and talk to people. What I tell my Republican colleagues is Iran is 0.44% of world GDP. We are 24%. China is 15%. Future historians are going to ask, why were we even talking about Iran in the 21st century? And Iran, with the Strait of Hormuz, they supply their oil to China, to South Korea, to India. We aren't dependent on their oil. So why are we worried about that region strategically? And the president has many flaws, but I think he understands that the overextension of our military in the Middle East has not been in American interest and is not something the people want.
You introduced an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act with Representative Gaetz, a Republican from Florida, to prevent unauthorized war with Iran. Do you think the president has the authority right now to launch a military strike against Iran in retaliation for the attacks on the Saudi oil field or any other reason?
I do not, because Saudi Arabia is not a treaty ally of the United States. If our troops were hit, or if one of our treaty allies were hit, then the president, under the war powers for 60 days, would have the ability to take action in American self-defense or American interest. But Gaetz, or my amendment, doesn't restrict the president from doing that,
right.
Or even taking preemptive action to prevent an attack on American interests. What our amendment says is we don't want another multi-year war in the Middle East. And before you deploy forces to get into a multi-year war, you have to come to Congress, and Congress isn't going to fund the deployment of those forces.
So this amendment passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. I think it was 271 votes.
251, yes.
51 votes, thank you, in the House. And then there was a similar amendment or legislation in the Senate that got 51 votes.
Right.
Again, this was bipartisan.
Yes.
What do you think explains this?
There is a wariness of endless war in this country. There's a recognition that our competition in the 21st century for leadership will be China. China hasn't been in a war since 1979. We've been in 40 conflicts. What are we doing? Why aren't we building our high-speed internet? Why aren't we building our infrastructure? Why aren't we investing in technology research? Why aren't we making the strategic decisions that will let us win the 21st century?
I have in front of me a half dozen letters that have been sent in support of retaining your language in the National Defense Authorization Act. They come from conservative groups like Concerned Veterans for America, Freedom Works, R Street. They come from pro-diplomacy groups, one of which was Ploughshares funds. We have letters from senators, from members of Congress, from Vote Vets. There's been I've seen a very strong support for this. How essential do you think it is that the Defense Authorization Act come back to the House and Senate with your legislation in it?
Absolutely critical. I can't think of something more critical than preventing us from getting into another war in the Middle East. And we need to tie the president's hands because he's got advisors around him who are trying to make every chess move to get us into an accidental confrontation or trigger some confrontation.
Right, so maybe not intentionally go to war, like, for example, former National Security Advisor John Bolton seemed to favor, but the pressure campaign itself could get us into a situation where some incident escalates into military conflict.
Exactly. And many wars, as you know, World War I and other wars in our in world history have started because of accidental miscalculation.
Yes.
And that is the risk, and this would mitigate that risk.
Let me get personal for a minute. Bipartisanship is very rare in Congress these days, and so your partnership with Congressman Gaetz is particularly unique. You're a Democrat from California, he's a Republican from Florida, and a staunch Trump supporter. You probably don't agree on, well, much of anything. So how did this partnership get started, and what's it been like?
Well, we don't agree on a lot of issues, particularly on gun violence and on issues of on so many social issues and issues of race and immigration.
No, I don't want to get your partnership in trouble here.
No, well, he knows that. He knows that. But we agree that one of the biggest issues for the United States is that we cannot be engaged in a military interventionism that is hurting our competitiveness and are hurting our ability to lead the 21st century. And Matt has been terrific on standing up to his own colleagues, to people like Liz Cheney, and saying these wars have not made America safer. I have actually had a fair amount of luck working with the House Freedom Caucus, and then I had an insight into this when I met with the Koch Institute, and they said, "Ro, some of the folks and Charles Koch himself is appreciative of some of the work you're doing on Yemen and Iran." And I said, "The Koch Institute is?" And this person said, jokingly, he said, "We know you're co-chairing Bernie Sanders' campaign, but given the choice between someone who would push for more wars and bankrupt the country that way, or someone who has who's pushing your progressive economic policies, the Kochs would probably take your progressive economic policies and military restraint." And that was an insight to me that there is an emerging understanding about the damage these wars have done to our country.
Yeah, we work with the Koch Foundation ourselves. We find common ground on these issues, as well as the issue of the military budget, which is a dilemma for you. The bill that's about to come back, the National Defense Authorization Act, that will have the Khanna Gaetz language in it, is also going to call for $738 billion worth of new military spending. This is kind of a Faustian bargain for you, isn't it? How do you feel about that level of military spending?
It's totally unjustified. It's $100 billion more than what Obama left the military with. Let me ask you this. We could give free public college to every American in this country for $80 billion. What would be better for our future national security? We could have affordable high-speed internet in this country for $40 billion.
Is this going to be a priority for you and the Progressive Caucus going forward to try to restore some rationality to our levels of military spending?
Yes. Do you know who the last president was who ran on actually cutting the defense budget? Jimmy Carter ran on 5 to 7% cuts in 1976, and he won. So it shows that you can win having smart, thoughtful cuts and redirecting it into investments that are going to be critical for our future. I think most people realize that our economy in a technology revolution is fueled by knowledge. Knowledge is the key ingredient to economic growth. And if you care about America, America has led since 1890. If you want to make sure that America continues to lead in the 21st century, I would invest in our human capital in as many ways as possible.
Amen. Amen. Okay, one last question, then I'll let you go to the caucus. You also introduced a resolution calling for the formal end of the Korean War back in February 2019. You did that with Representatives Andy Kim, Barbara Lee, Pramila Jayapal, Debbie Holland, and Jan Schakowsky, and others. Why do you think it's important for us to declare an end to the Korean War, and what's happened to that legislation?
Well, I don't think most Americans know that we still haven't declared an end to the war and that we're with a 1953 armistice. It's long overdue that we have an end to this war, and it would help us solve the crisis. I was speaking with one of President Moon's senior advisors, and he laid out a clear framework for how we get peace. He said we should, without condition, sign a permanent peace agreement. And if we do that, it will give Kim Jong-un the leverage to have denuclearization, and then we don't have to reduce the sanctions. We could then require him to have 80-90% denuclearization and have, then once they do that, have snapback provisions to start lowering the sanctions. But his view is that just the gesture of having permanent peace would go a long way and give Kim Jong-un the flexibility to do what he needs.
Yes.
So everyone understands, in my view, what the framework is, and Bolton tried to sabotage it in so many ways. Congress can pass this so that we can work to achieve it. And, Trump keeps bragging about the Nobel Peace Prize. Maybe he ought to try to do something. He's had support from Democrats in Congress to go pursue diplomacy in North Korea.
Well, Representative Khan, I want to thank you so much for taking this time. It's an honor to be with you on
My
this
honor.
Historic day up here in the House of Representatives. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
In this episode, we go back in the silo with Ploughshares Fund Development Associate Elissa Karim. She spent a day with protesters outside of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, marking 74 years since the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Japan. Here is her report.
Thank you, everyone for being here today. Thank you, Tri-Valley Cares. I thank you for taking the political and very human stance of saying no to nuclear proliferation and an end to nuclear warfare.
Every year on Hiroshima Day, protesters gather in front of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory to protest the designing of Armageddon. On the 74th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, I went out to the lab in Livermore, California, a town an hour outside of San Francisco and one of 2 sites where all of the U.S.'s nuclear weapons are manufactured. You can tell that nukes are a pretty big deal to Livermore by looking at the city seal. If you Google it, you'll discover that it features grapes, a cowboy, and an atom in the center. We were on the side of the road, right outside the Livermore lab, right next to a busy intersection where there was a ton of cars traveling through. Some of them were honking in support of what we were doing, and some were very obviously honking against what we were doing.
Okay, well, you got right on the right list.
The crowd included longtime anti-nuclear protesters like J.C. Orton, a Catholic worker from Berkeley, California, who has protested and been arrested in front of Livermore countless times.
Instead of just thinking about it and writing letters and talking to people, get out there and make yourself known.
And younger activists like Mariah Chirmack, a volunteer from Beyond the Bomb. What do you hope to accomplish by coming to today's event?
I'm always just seeking to make this message louder because I don't think people will hear it until it's too late. And the cost of being too late on this message is horrible.
The protest was led by Mary Kaszynski, the executive director of Tri-Valley Cares, a Ploughshares Fund grantee.
Imagine for a moment that you live in Hiroshima, Japan, 74 years ago today. Are you eating breakfast with a loved one? Or are you thinking of your kids whom you've just sent off to school? Maybe you saw an American B-29 plane in the sky. Some people did. Now the atomic bomb is falling.
We also heard from Nobuaki Hanaoka, a survivor of the bombings who was just a baby at the time. His mother and sister died from leukemia brought on by radiation poisoning after they left Hiroshima. He thought the same thing would happen to him after overhearing a doctor say he wouldn't make it to his 10th birthday. Although he lived to see his 10th birthday and is still alive today, he's had to deal with the psychological effects of losing his family and his community to the bombs his whole life.
Psychologically, I always lived afraid that radiation might start killing me anytime. But I'm okay, I'm 74. I'm old enough to live to see you all and speak about it.
I also met Scott, a lawyer for Tri-Valley Cares, who revealed some fascinating history about the protests in front of the Livermore lab and the tension between the lab and the community itself.
Well, one of the reasons why Tri-Valley Cares exists is because back in the early 80s, there would be these large protests out at the lab. In fact, the largest mass arrest in Alameda County occurred outside of Livermore Lab in 1982 and 3. The lab is the largest employer in the town. It employs over 7,000 people, many of whom live here in Livermore, but also regionally. We are local people here in the community saying, no, we object to nuclear weapons, and we're here to throw a wrench in that, to be the face of the anti-nuclear weapons community in the whole country, but doing it right here where the weapons are developed.
When the die-ins started, we laid down on the ground in front of the lab entrance and had our silhouettes outlined in chalk. This was to acknowledge those who were vaporized upon detonation and whose shadows were left on walls and sidewalks. Peace activists are laying on the ground being chalked after a call to action with sirens. It's been about 5 minutes. The Livermore security are decked out in riot gear, probably about a dozen of them on the other side of the gate, which has been locked, and the police are already here as well. There's probably 40 people laying on the ground and others standing. The ones that will not get up will be arrested.
I am Officer Brian Sleeper, a police officer of the City of Livermore and a peace officer of the State of California. I hereby inform you that you are in violation of state and city laws and that this is an unlawful assemblage. In the name of the people of the state of California, I order you to disperse immediately. Failure to disperse will mean you are subject to arrest.
We're the people you serve. No more nukes in our name.
The gate is being opened at Livermore, and the security and policemen are getting ready to arrest people that are blocking and sitting in front of the gate.
Hey, we're ready to sing, right, y'all? Yeah. 1, 2, 1, 2. Sooner, very soon, we are born.
It was quite a contrast to see singing and dancing protesters against a backdrop of full riot gear, batons, and sirens. And ironically, the police arrested us to protect the community, but we were there demanding that the city and state protect us from nuclear weapons.
I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside.
I came away from the Livermore protest inspired by the connections people have to this issue. It reminded me that there are spaces where nukes are seen as objective reality. But at this protest, we went into that space and rejected nukes as a community and considered the broader implications that nukes have on all of us.
Now this is what Daniel Ellsberg taught me.
Being at this protest reminded me why this work is so important to me. It is connected to environmental issues, feminist issues, and democracy. If this story inspires you, visit Ploughshares.org to learn more.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit Ploughshares.org.